Hi, I'm Ingo from Roast Rebels, and in this video we will talk about the most important factor when it comes to coffee roasting, about the green coffee beans. Chris Kornman is one of the most experienced coffee buyers, coffee traders. He's a coffee roaster, an educator, and he's also author of this book, Green Coffee, which is a book that I really highly recommend to anyone working with coffee. You can find it if you press on the link here. The book is all about everything you need to know about green coffee, about the different processing methods, about the different measuring methods, what it's about when it comes to quality. The book goes quite into technical details, but it's written in a way that anybody understands it. It's really beautifully made, well written, nicely edited, and the content is really superb. So I really highly recommend this book to anyone working with coffee. Chris was so nice to answer various questions on green coffee from our community in an online Q&A session. You will see now the recording of this Q&A session. It's really a broad collection of questions that Chris answered in this Q&A session. So I really recommend you take a paper, take yourself notes. The value that you will get out of this Q&A is really high. In addition to that, there has also been a video that Chris and I recorded a couple of weeks ago. You will find it here, where we get a bit more structured into all these topics. It's really a nice addition to the Q&A session. But now, I wish you a lot of fun. Take yourself notes and enjoy the Q&A recording. First one is, what is the best way to store green beans? He's writing after opening the plastic bag, so he's probably more of a home roaster. You can maybe answer this question with a view on home roasters or small scale roasters like nano roasteries or smaller roasteries.
Sure. The best storage option, whether you're large or small, is probably to maintain as best as possible hermetic seal. So resealing that bag if possible, or using some other kind of method to preserve the coffee. Ideally, your storage conditions would also reflect relatively low ambient temperatures and relatively low relative humidity. There's a lot of folks talking about green coffee freezing out there for long-term storage, and I can say that my limited experience would indicate that even non-commercial freezers can probably have benefits if you're trying to store green coffee for, let's say, maybe 6 months or a year after it's been opened. That might be one method that you could use to really extend shelf life.
So, but would you recommend to keep the coffees in these plastic bags or in this Grainpro or whatever, or would you kind of open it?
Yeah, my general practice, here and at Intelligentsia, when I was working there at large scales, was to, if we ever didn't finish a full bag of coffee, that we'd take that Grainpro and try to cinch it back up in some way, either using a zip tie or rubber band or some kind of clip, potentially putting it into a storage bin or something to kind of enhance that protection. But the Grainpro bags, or even the Ziploc bags that you're getting at small scales, are probably going to do a better job of preserving the quality than just about anything else. So you should try to keep them ideally and just reseal it.
How long can I actually store coffee beans without quality issues? What's your recommendation on?
Yeah, that depends on a number of factors, I think. The first being, how long off harvest, I think, is the thing that most people tend to think of. And a good general guideline might be that anywhere between 6 and 12 months, you should be able to get great flavors out of that coffee. Mm-hmm. There are some techniques that you can use to extend that, and there's some mitigating circumstances that might reduce it. Water activity specifically, and as well as moisture content, are really related to quality loss over time in green coffee. And so if you have coffees that have high water activities, they are more likely to sort of give up those compounds that are bound up in the green coffee itself, and they're going to do that more rapidly. And so you might have a delicious tasting coffee with a relatively high water activity, even in good storage conditions, that might begin to fade somewhat quickly. In excellent storage conditions, if you have good hermetic sealing and relatively stable temperatures, I've seen Ethiopian coffee specifically, lasts a year and a half off harvest and still taste great. So there's kind of a range depending on a couple of factors.
Mm. So Tom is asking if we stay on the same topic, because he says he's going to start a small roastery next year. And he's asking for concrete recommendation on, do you have any recommendation on how to build a storage room as cheaply as possible, but still effectively to keep a stable level of temperature and humidity?
Yeah, I'm not an architect, so don't take my recommendation on building word for word. But and I'm going to talk in Fahrenheit because I'm very bad at converting Fahrenheit and Celsius. I'm sorry. But 65 degrees Fahrenheit is the sort of like gold standard for stability. And probably lower is better than higher if you had to go one way or the other. And then similarly, relative humidity is recommended to be about the same percentage, about 65% relative humidity. And again, relatively lower would be better than relatively higher, because I would rather have my coffee dry out a little bit over time than to absorb moisture from the environment over time. That causes a lot of problems.
Okay.
You might consider building a small room with good ventilation. It's nice to have a bit of airflow, because the more stagnant things get, the higher the potential for, must and mold and that kind of thing to grow.
Okay. He's asking about air conditioning. Does it make sense to have an air conditioning?
It depends on how high your temperatures get during the warm time of year, because if it does get above, say, 80 degrees on a regular extended basis, then yeah, you're probably going to have some quality issues that arise as temperatures begin to rise. In Chicago, when I was roasting there, our warehouse was heated but not air conditioned. And during the summer in Chicago, for about, I would say, 2 or 3 months, there would be many days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And overall, we didn't really start to see problems until those temperatures began to come back down. And as the temperatures declined, then those coffees that were exposed to high temperatures began to fade more rapidly than coffees that were protected better. So I would say it's not strictly necessary, but it could improve your results. Okay. And if you have people that are working in that, unair conditioned condition, it might be worth considering their needs too.
Yeah, sure. Tom, I hope this answers your question, because you also commented it's usually below 40 degrees in summer, which is something like 100 Fahrenheit. So it's probably similar to what you just mentioned when it comes to your Chicago warehouse.
Yeah, I think that probably using good sealing and storage practices might do more for you than air conditioning.
Yeah. Okay. There was one question that came before the session, and he asked, because he wants to go to the Asian area and visit some plantations to find beans there. And he is asking more or less general, how can I find out which is a good plantation or which is a good farm? What are kind of the criteria you're going to look at?
That's really interesting. Yeah. I would look for someone that's starting off. If you're going someplace that you're not familiar with, I would look for a host that's fairly well established and someone that's good at communication and organization. And you can usually tell that by, getting on the phone with them if you can, or exchanging emails and getting a sense of their organizational strategy. I think that having some kind of itinerary in place before you go, and probably having some recommendations from other people as well, to help to ensure that the place that you're going to is accessible and safe and, of the quality that you expect. Um, that being said, I think, some of my favorite travel, misadventures, maybe let's say, have been when I've been not fully prepared and had some misunderstandings and was able to frankly, learn quite a lot from the people that I was visiting, about the way that coffee is handled and grown, sometimes kind of behind the curtain, I guess you could say. So, you be careful when you're traveling. And I think, I always try to reinforce the idea of like respecting the people who do live there and work there on a regular basis, and their time and their energy and the fact that it's their culture. But ultimately, I think, a couple of small checks, and usually getting a recommendation from a friend or a trusted colleague or something like that will go quite a long way. Um, if you have access to samples beforehand too, or someone that's working with coffee from the region, you might be able to find out, some places that are already, possibly exporting some excellent beans. That might be a good place to start.
Okay. Yeah, samples is a good topic because that was another question of him. And he asked, when it comes to samples, when he gets samples, what he has to look after to find out if they're good or not. So is it only the taste that he has to consider, or are there other parameters to check when he has samples of beans?
Yeah, absolutely. Samples come. I think that people don't always realize that there's a couple of different ways that samples might be prepared, and many samples that are prepared before coffee is sold or exported are prepared by hand in some cases, or at least at small scales. And as a result, you potentially might be getting something that's been, represented in a way that's not accurate of the full coffee lot. So being careful to ask questions about, is this a final milled sample? Is this representative? Or is this simply like the my least favorite type of sample is called a type sample, where it's like, this is an example of what the producer might be able to produce, but it doesn't actually have any grounding in reality. So making sure that you're clear and your communication is, able to identify exactly where the coffee is in the process and what it actually represents is always one of my first questions. And then physical quality for me too is really important, especially when it is when I know that I'm working with a hand milled sample that's pre final milling. This is my first chance to get an idea of like what the quality is. And so I'm definitely looking for sensory quality, but I'm also looking at physical stuff, and knowing that even though it may not be fully representational of the final milled process, noting things that I might be able to help the producer identify and change later on down the way. If I have specific requests about the preparation of this coffee, is the screen size variance too large, for example, or is the moisture content measuring too high? Those, if it's pre-milled, those can be corrected. That's an opportunity for improvement, and that's kind of exciting in a way.
So is there kind of a process, or the question that Stefan asked, do you evaluate new beans from pre-shipment samples to the last bag? But maybe you can just in general tell how you are doing it when you're kind of finding new beans. So at what stages are you taking samples, and how do you evaluate the quality from, let's say, farm to your warehouse?
Right. So if I'm establishing a new relationship, I'm often getting offer samples that may or may not be fully representational, but it's an introduction. It's a foot in the door for the producer. And so it's an opportunity for me to provide some honest feedback about what they've shown and indicate to them what my preferences are. In many cases, that new relationship is like, you're getting to know each other and what you prefer and don't prefer. Not all coffee customers have the same, tastes preferences or preparation requirements. And so the producers need to know that too, to better prepare their samples for your needs. Once we move past that process and start to talk about actually making a transaction, making a sale, then the next question is, how do I protect myself against getting something that is, milled poorly, for example? And the way that I do that is I do request a pre-shipment sample once the coffee is finally prepped. And that's written into the contract, and usually written as something like replacement option so that the producer also has protection. If something comes out wrong, if I reject that pre-shipment sample, even after prior approval of an offer sample, then the producer has the option still to try to sell me something else to replace it. And I think that that's, one way that both parties in the transaction can be a little bit protected. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, but now you're still talking about the pre-shipment samples. So what are the next steps then from pre-shipment until the warehouse?
Okay, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, so pre-shipment is basically the final chance to start or stop that coffee moving across an ocean, usually, or at least across, some sort of, it's a transaction that you can't exactly take back at that point. So that approval is more or less final. After that, though, I would strongly encourage all roasters of any size to sample the coffees that they receive upon arrival. Usually I just call that an arrival sample. And it may be that, you've taken a pre-shipment sample from an exporter who warehouses your coffee domestically, and the difference between the approval and the arrival may only be a matter of a couple of days or a week in that case. Or, like me, if I'm approving a coffee from Burundi, for example, that coffee gets onto a boat or onto a truck to go to Dar es Salaam, to get onto a boat, to go across, multiple shipping lines and eventually land here in California. And it could be a matter of months in that case. And in both cases, it's really important to evaluate the physical and sensory quality again to confirm that what you've received is what you paid for. In very rare circumstances, there are occasional mix-ups and occasional problems in shipping that could cause quality issues, and those can be resolved with good communication and amicable conversation about the way that this can be taken care of. I would say that if you do have a problem with the sample in that regard, approach it with respect for the humanity on the other side of the equation, and usually that helps go a long way toward resolving things in a way that's beneficial for everyone involved. So the arrival sample would be like maybe the most important next step after coffee is received. And then from time to time, I would say, if you're on a regular production schedule and you're taking samples of that production normally, then you're probably in good shape. But if it's a coffee that sits around for a while, for example, Royal Coffee, my parent company, my employer, we store coffee long term in a green coffee warehouse to sell to roasters, and so we're not actively roasting our inventory. And so we do audits regularly to ensure that the quality is still the way we evaluated it, a few weeks or a few months ago. So that's an important follow-up step, I would say.
So then you're keeping also green coffee of your pre-shipment sample so that you can compare then the arrival and the pre-shipment sample as a green and also as a roasted coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. As often as possible, I try to retain a little bit of the original pre-shipment sample to compare. I would say it's incredibly rare that I end up having to go back and confirm that, but it does ensure, in the rare chance that something comes in that's not what we approved, I have the physical proof as well as the sensory proof to be able to take to my supplier and say, we have a problem, how can we fix this?
Okay. And then you're going to evaluate 300 grams of coffee and check for defects, and then roast 100 gram, check for Quakers, and do a sensory analysis, or how is the
yeah analysis? At this point in my career, I don't do a full physical defect count on coffees unless I observe anecdotally that there's a problem. The most important information for me as a buyer and roaster are moisture and density. So I take those, and then if moisture is elevated, then I also take water activity as a next step. I do a physical evaluation by eyesight, but I'm not going to count those defects necessarily unless I can tell that there really is a genuine problem. If there's a couple of chipped beans or secondaries, I'm probably not going to take that into account unless I've specifically informed my supplier that I need, you know, immaculately clean coffee and paying, you know, the requisite premium for that. So those are my evaluation steps before roasting, in part because I think moisture and water activity tell me so much about how the coffee is going to travel and age, and then density tells me quite a bit about how it's going to roast. So those are my two most important.
Okay. And then there was a question concerning moisture level. Is there kind of an alternative or an easier way to measure measure the moisture content of green coffee if you don't have an electronic device? Is there kind of a workaround or possibility, or kind of with the weight loss when you roast the coffee? Or
technically speaking, that's what all these devices are trying to do, is to replicate a very slow, low temperature oven that measures the weight difference between, you know, unroasted and you know, just moisture removal. The thing about roasting and the way that coffee roasters do it is that not all moisture disappears. And I've seen some studies recently by University of California, Davis, that indicate that as much as, you know, 5 to 7% moisture might still be present in the coffee beans even after first crack. And so that's kind of a lot. And you would really have to roast your coffee quite dark to be able to either and at that point you start burning away some of the coffee mass itself, and so you really haven't done yourself any favors in terms of measurement. The other way to do it would be to take a you know, well calibrated balance and a very low temperature oven and kind of slow roast that coffee in a way that doesn't degrade the green coffee solids but does remove the moisture slowly over time. It's probably not the most efficient way to do it. If you are working with a reputable conscientious importer, they should probably have that information for you. And even, you know, in many cases, exporters and farmers might have some of that information. And I would say try asking and see if that information might be available to you so that you don't have to measure it yourself. Because I know that these devices can be cost prohibitive, and especially the cheap ones are not very good, unfortunately.
Okay, good to know. Some people, or sometimes there is the recommendation around to check green coffee beans with the ultraviolet lamp. Are you doing that? So what is it for, and is it necessary to do this check?
So I do not do it on a regular basis, although I've met a number of colleagues who do. The idea is that you can highlight anomalies in fermentation, and that you can also observe mold in some cases. And those are both true to a degree. And the other thing that often will highlight is if a coffee bean is like nicked in the pulper and is then fermented, even if it's not defective, a lot of times that will also show up under black light or ultraviolet light. And so I feel like the return on like false positives under UV is a little high for me to use it as a reliable evaluation tool in the same way that I use moisture and density, but I understand how it could be useful in determining things like, you know, if you maybe had a mixed batch of two different coffees that got blended together or something like that, you could potentially see that under UV light more easily than under, you know, normal daylight. I don't recommend it because there's so much anecdotal observation and so little hard science attached to it, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful.
Okay. And there's another question in the F&A. When you are buying coffee online, so for example, as a home roaster or small roaster, I mean, you're also offering green coffees online to buy. What is the aspects a buyer has to look for? Is it like elevation, or what is actually, how can the people find the right coffees for themselves when they're buying them online?
Yeah, that's tough because I think the industry at large and importers specifically have this like cage of information that they're trying to convey in these very fixed ways. And so coffees end up being very hard to decipher when you're just looking at stats like that. elevation for me is so contingent on geography as well. Like at 1,200 meters in Kenya is probably not going to be producing excellent coffee, but if you're at 1,200 meters in Brazil, that's, you know, close to as high as it gets there. So it it depends a little on the kinds of things you're looking for. I would say the first thing that I pay attention to when I'm buying any coffee, whether it's roasted or green, is the style of processing method. So we look for whether it's a natural or washed or some sort of experimental or hybrid process, because that's going to tell you more about the flavor profile than just about anything else. You know, you can make some very broad assumptions that naturals are going to be fruity, washed coffees are going to be bright and clean. And it's not going to tell you everything, but it will get you, it'll steer you in, you know, a direction if you're looking for specific flavors. The other thing I would try to look for is seasonality, if the harvest timeline is published, because, you know, importers, especially larger importers, often have a backlog of coffees that are relatively old. Now, you know, Royal removes all of our older green coffee from our website, so you can't see it if it's past, I think, a year off harvest. I can't remember the exact date. I'm not exactly sure if that practice is standardized, and I would suggest that it probably isn't. And so try to, you know, see if you can find out when the coffee was harvested, because you probably want fresh coffee if you know you want it to taste good. And then, you know, maybe take a look at cultivar. That can tell you a little bit of information, like the variety of the coffee. If you're looking for something relatively traditional, sticking with legacy varieties like Bourbon, Caturra, Typica might be helpful. If you want something that's a little more cutting edge, things like, you know, Geishas or the Whoosh Whoosh or whatever the hot cultivar at the moment might be, those can give you some indication of flavor profile as well. And then taking a look at the final thing would be like looking at the scale of the production. And you can usually determine that at least at some degree by looking at the name of either the association, cooperative, or the supplier. You can usually tell if it's a single estate farm, and that often will indicate that there's a degree of vertical integration and infrastructure that can provide some degree of good quality that might not be present in an unorganized association. Now, if the cooperative is well established, then often they'll have, you know, numbers of members listed, or things like the specific region where they're operating in, and those can be indications of well-run, well-organized cooperatives, and that might be helpful too, as opposed to finding some sort of, you know, regional generic large association of cooperatives that is maybe a little bit less attentive to detail. I guess that's what I would look for.
Okay. So you're quite focused on the processing method, and you also, I think in the book you've written that there were studies that are showing the processing has kind of the highest influence. So there's kind of the processing, the cultivar or varietal, but there is also the origin or the terroir. So I mean, like Kenyan coffee has a typical taste profile, like probably in Indian coffee is a kind of so to what extent should people look at, you know, the different aspects? So in particular, the origin of the coffee, is this diminishing with these new processing methods, or is it still?
Yeah, I think I'd argue that we're in a really unique time in coffee history, because we're seeing some of these like international borders of coffee origins breaking down a little bit, which is exciting in a way. You know, there are a lot of established traditional regional flavor profiles, and you mentioned Kenya as a classic example of that, like grapefruit and maybe sometimes slightly savory, the, you know, black currant kind of flavor as being very traditional in that region. And it remains that way in traditionally processed Kenyan coffees, but we're also seeing naturals out of Kenya now that we weren't seeing 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And we're seeing SL variety, you know, SL28s and SL34s that are commonly grown in Kenya now growing elsewhere in the world and producing some of those same very interesting, you know, bright, savory, sweet flavors that would fool a cupper at a blind tasting, I think. So yes, there are a number of traditionally established flavor profiles based on regionality. And I think that Ethiopia is probably remains the most iconic of those, in that washed grade one is almost always going to have, soft citrus and floral notes, and a natural grade one is always going to have clean berry flavors and a little bit of a chocolatey backdrop. And there's iterations of that are innumerable, but it's always some variation on that theme in a traditional way. Outside of that, if you're looking to coffees with a high degree of specificity and differentiated nature on the specialty market, then it's kind of an open question about whether or not where they're grown is going to affect the way they taste. I have seen anecdotally, and it's really, I think, good for me to have seen it republished in multiple iterations by a number of different scientists regarding the fact that fermentation and processing method remains the single most influential factor on a coffee's flavor profile.
Okay, interesting. So that would mean that the original taste is also coming from the the cultivar and the processing methods that are common in that region.
Absolutely, and potentially things like native yeasts or just traditional practices, at the washing station, where we saw, Kenyan coffees, for example, have a common secondary post-fermentation soak that didn't used to be common elsewhere in the world, and that also contributes significantly to the flavor profile of those coffees.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Nicola, you have a question?
Yeah. Hey, Chris. Hello. Looking forward to read your book, by the way. You've mentioned water activity already, and as an enthusiastic home roaster, it's one of the things I haven't really been able to wrap my head around. Is that something you can elaborate a bit on?
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of goes hand in hand. It's like the other side of the coin of moisture content. So if you think about moisture content as the percentage of water that, by weight is part of the green coffee, water activity is a measurement of basically evaporation, like vapor pressure. So if there's moisture in the green coffee bean, it's going to want to escape into the environment. And water activity is the measurement of the rate at which it tries to escape. When water moves from green coffee to the ambient environment, it's also bringing with it, some of the things that are part of the green coffee itself, those green coffee solids. It's taking, taking flavor away in a very, layman's terms, I suppose. And so that it also has implications for food safety and shelf life as a result. And it's been used, since the 1950s as the primary measurement for any sort of like product safety in terms of, is this product going to grow mold, for example, while it's in storage? So there's a number of reasons that I think that measurement is important for folks to know about, especially if you're working in a commercial environment. There's a lot about that topic in the book that hopefully will be helpful to you, but that's the basics. If we were to break the implications for roasters down into three basic pillars in order of importance, it would be product safety, shelf stability, and finally the potential for sugar browning reactions or color change implications. Water activity can tell us a little bit about how fast or slow the coffee might react to heat in the roaster, particularly during middle and later stages as color develops. Water activity might accelerate browning process a little bit. So high water activity coffees might require a gentler touch in terms of color development.
So from the ones that are a bit more difficult to measure to an easier one, there was one question also on Slido on how can he measure the density of the beans? So what kind of density measurement would you recommend?
Yeah, this is great because for me, it tells me a lot about how coffee is going to roast, and it's very easy to measure. It's something that I think I spent when I was younger, 15 years ago, as a professional coffee roaster who didn't have a deep background in theory, I spent a lot of time thinking about density without really knowing about it, and made all these observations about coffees that I thought were like slow to react to heat in the roaster or fast to react, and associated those with density. And then I actually started taking some measurements, and a lot of those ideas were on the right track, but not necessarily informed by data. And so the thing about density is all you need is a cup and a scale. And you can measure density really easily. If you're working in grams and milliliters, which I prefer to, I would take a relatively small cup and fill it to the brim with water and measure the weight of that water in milliliters. Milliliters and grams are, for practical purposes, interchangeable if you're roughly, close to sea level and room temperature. Even if you're at relatively high elevation, it's probably not going to make a big enough difference for you in this particular application, since we're not doing, micrograms or anything like that. So once you know the volume of your vessel, make sure it's dry, and then you can fill it with green coffee and take that same measurement. You'll get the weight of the green coffee, divide that weight of green coffee by the total volume capacity of your vessel, and that gives you your density in grams per milliliter. I like to think of coffee density in grams per liter because it makes more sense to me in just a very practical application. It's not the way scientists talk usually in density terms, but it makes sense to me. So if I have a green coffee that's, say, 700 grams per liter in density, that means that in a liter of space, physical space, I can fit 700 grams of coffee in there. And I would consider that, in my experience, a relatively high density coffee. It's going to vary a little bit depending on the size and shape of your vessel, just the way that coffee naturally freely settles into these vessels. But if you take a couple different measurements over time, and I would say maybe 2 or 3 measurements per coffee to take an average, so that you kind of average out the human factor, the potential error, then you can start to observe trends over time. And I've published a couple of these things both in the book and on the Royal Coffee blog. So if you want to read a little bit more in depth about that, the information is out there. For me, it's my favorite measurement because it's the easiest to do, and it tells you a lot about how much coffee is able to fit in space, which is practically important for, so many just random practical logistical applications. And then it also tells me a lot about how coffee is going to react to heat in the roaster, especially early in the roasting process.
Can you go a bit more in detail on this? So now you have a more dense or less dense coffee. What kind of decisions or what information is it giving you that you then will applicate as a roaster?
Absolutely. Denser coffees, as strictly speaking, if we're looking at the way that they react in the roaster, denser coffees tend to act as a buffer against heat in a way. So they are slower to respond to heat uptake. And the result of that is usually that roasters will tend to favor hotter, faster approaches to those types of coffees. If you think about coffees specifically from Southern Colombia, Southern Ethiopia, and the traditional growing regions of like Nyeri, Kenya, those are some of the densest coffees on earth, and all of those tend to be coffees that roasters generally roast a little hotter and faster, and that's in my opinion, that's the result of their high densities. You start out fast, and then you have to slow it down a little bit later. The opposite is true to a degree in lower density coffees, and you think of examples of this might be like Brazil, Sumatra, and in general, it's not always true, but often true that natural or experimental process coffees tend to be lower in density than washed coffees, and those, generally speaking, tend to show off a higher degree of complexity, a greater degree of sweetness, and just on a very unmeasurable pleasurability scale, they just taste better when you roast them a little gentler early in the roasting process.
Is there a higher risk of scorching in less dense beans or
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I always, with lower density coffees, I'm always starting with a lower charge temperature, and I'm doing a bit of a soak on that turnaround, the turning point, as opposed to high density coffees, which I think in some cases, especially the highest density washed coffees, they're almost impossible to scorch, and they don't don't often need soak.
Okay. Another question then is on defects. So what defects do we need to look after when it comes to prevent a bad influence on the taste? So what are kind of the bad defects that
Sure.
can't be in the coffee?
Physical defect wise, fully black beans and fully sour beans and fully moldy beans tend to be the big ones, and they relate often cases they'll relate to specific flavor defects as well. So oftentimes the black beans will taste phenolic, oftentimes the sour beans will taste fermented, and oftentimes the moldy beans will taste moldy. So you got your big three right there. I would say that most of the rest of the physical defect problems are a matter of quantity. So if you have a couple of insect bitten beans in your batch, it's probably not a huge deal. If it's pervasive, if it's, a lot of your coffee, then it's going to affect things like, the inherent flavor of that green coffee. There's just less of it. And then it also affects how it roasts because it is less dense as a result, right? So you end up with charred tasting coffee. And this is true of like chipped beans as well. Those beans aren't necessarily any better or worse inherently, but because of the effect of chipping on the surface area to volume ratio, they become inconsistent in the roaster. So defect wise, physically, I'm always looking for the ones that are easy to identify because they often have the biggest flavor impact for me. And then there's, of course, the fourth major sensory defect, potato, which is not identifiable in physical form.
So are you kind of sorting the coffees before or after roasting?
Before roasting, yeah, for sure. I feel like green coffee tells me more about quality potential in that way. And so if I do a full physical count, then I'm often taking a record of that, like, taking a snapshot on my phone to share with someone who might need that information. If I'm doing a cursory inspection, I'll take roughly 300 grams and I'll do a loose sort. And if I notice a few beans that look problematic to me, then that's when I, pull out the mat and do a full grade. But if it looks relatively clean on initial inspection, and it tastes good after a couple of samples, then usually I'm not too worried about trying to count, how many minor defects might be in that coffee.
Okay.
Davis is currently developing a phone app that can potentially identify visible defects in both roasted and hopefully, if I can influence them a little bit, also on green coffee, which might be kind of cool. I don't know when it's set to release, but it's in its early stages, and I've seen a few iterations. It's kind of cool. So hopefully we'll democratize that process a little bit in the near future as well.
Yeah, because there's kind of not really a standard. It's a bit quality is a bit measured in different ways depending on the origin.
There is a standard, but everyone's got a different one, I think, is part of the problem. So there's the SCA, and they have multiple grades that no one knows about. And then there's the Green Coffee Association, which is what is used in New York to set commodities. And there's, I think, 8 accepted grades of commodity before it gets into differentials below the market. And then, of course, every particular origin has their own set of standards. So yeah, it's complicated.
Okay. Tom, the one who's going to found a roastery soon, is asking, what do you think about a color sorter, in a roastery? Is it something that you would invest in when you have a roastery?
No, not at small scale, at least. I would say that this has been a topic of debate here too in the States, and Counterculture was probably one of the first roasters that I knew locally that was using color sorting. And, they're at a pretty high volume for specialty roaster. And so I think to some extent it made sense to them. And they're not running every single coffee through that color sorter. It's really just their high-end product. But, it's a significant investment in technology. And the fact of the matter is that technology has already been invested in by exporters and dry millers. And so if there's something, and again, this might be something that's at scale, if you're buying the entirety of a 10 or 50 bag micro lot from a single producer, if you're able to specify before it goes to milling how many defects you want in that, they can do that work for you, likely at a fraction of the cost because the equipment's already installed. So that would be my first recommendation to roasters that are anything less than a couple 100,000 pounds of coffee a year. Once you start getting in the neighborhood of 1 million pounds annually, then if you are extremely concerned about the integrity of a few of your product lines, it might be worth investing in a color sorter. Royal has just now allocated some funds to do this for our crown jewel product line and 1 or 2 other small product lines, but it's not going to be for every coffee that we carry.
Okay. So as a roaster, you still have the possibility to, go to an importer or a trader and then take coffee of better quality, evaluate the samples, and then decide on this.
Yeah, I would suggest that you should communicate up the supply stream and see who has that technology ready and where you can communicate your preferences to have the greatest impact. I think that there's always this tendency. It's like, well, I can do it myself. And the fact of the matter is, in a lot of cases, that work is already being done, and all you have to do is communicate and pay appropriately for it, and the work will be done for you.
Perfect. Then one question is on how to roast, these new experimental processed coffees. They're sometimes a bit like tricky to roast, like this anaerobic or carbonic maceration coffees.
Yeah. Carefully. It's a brave new world out there. I think that having discussed this a little bit with a few other roaster friends, the general opinion is to treat them gently. And the general observation is that they are not consistent, in part because there is such a wide variation of what people are doing and types of, mixed fermentation or multi-stage fermentations. So it's just not homogenized yet. And you can't really just draw a straight line that says, well, all coffees labeled as anaerobically fermented are going to need, 20 degrees lower charge temperature and 50 seconds more Green Maillard. There's not enough data yet, first of all. And second of all, the processes are so wide in variation that there's no universal takeaways. So treat every single one of these coffees as a unique little unicorn. And I would say, generally speaking, start with a lower charge temperature, feel it out a bit like a natural, expect a spike in rate of rise at or slightly after first crack in most cases, and anticipate that if you can. See if you can, mitigate that a little bit, because I think a gentle rate of rise after first crack, even if you're going for a slightly darker roasting style, keeping that low and slow after first crack is really going to preserve the kinds of interesting flavors that have been created and developed by the processor in those cases. And then try not to race through Maillard reactions if you can. Give it a nice, development time during that time period as well. So, at the average roasting pace, if you're taking your washed coffees, let's say, I don't know what folks are roasting like in Europe these days, but maybe our standard practice might be like 8 to 10 minutes as an average, like washed coffee from Ethiopia or Kenya, let's say, a relatively quick and bright coffee. I would say push that out by full time, maybe like a minute to a minute and a half, and try to distribute that time somewhat evenly, especially in the early stages, and maybe just a little bit lower rate of rise in the later stages. That's my baseline recommendation. And then just observe, repeat, improve.
Thanks a lot. When it comes to trends, what is it kind of? Do you see any particular trends that are coming in the next years? I think these processing methods, they're already here. Is there kind of the new big thing that's going on in coffee?
What's next? You know, it's hard to look into the crystal ball and know for sure. I think that part of the reason that we are seeing a lot of these new styles of fermentation, these highly differentiated coffees, is because overall coffee, even as a specialty product, is becoming more homogeneous. And I think that that's probably a result of a couple of factors, one of them potentially being climate change, others being more sophistication in processing and handling. And, you know, that's created an entire sector of the specialty market that really resembles a polished version of the commodity market. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does make finding the coffees, you know, I'm not old by any real measurement unless you're a teenager, but I do remember, you know, coffees from when I was in college, let's say university, and remembering these ideas of what an Ethiopian Harar natural process used to taste like. And the result of this like high level super commodity or low level specialty commodity, whatever you want to call it, is that those coffees just aren't around as much anymore. And so finding the little gems, you know, the needles in the haystack, so to speak, is becoming more difficult, and we're seeing new differentiated methods of getting there. One of them being processing method, another being cultivar development. The F1 hybrids that are coming out of World Coffee Research are an attempt to find ways to create exciting tasting coffees that are also resistant to disease and climate change. You know, one of the problems with, I think, both of these things is that there's sort of a barrier to entry for many coffee producers because they're expensive. Both the hybrids and the interesting processing methods, they require a degree of infrastructure and finesse in processing that not everyone is able to achieve. So those are some trends that I see emerging on the green coffee side of things at the moment. I'm not sure what else is on the horizon exactly. I think that shipping timeframes are going to start to condense a little bit, but I don't think we're ever going to return to a pre-COVID, rapid overseas shipment like we saw. So that's maybe another thing to think about.
Yeah, perfect. Hey, thank you so much. I think we've covered actually all the questions that were around, and all I can see now in the chat is a big thank you for for this webinar and for all the questions you answered. Also from my side, thanks a lot. It's always really exciting to talk with you and learn that much about green coffee or roasting. So it's really exciting to talk with you. Thanks a lot for all the information you shared. And again, also thanks a lot. I told you already many times, but I really love the book Green Coffee and also your blogs on your website and all you're doing. So yeah, thanks a lot for all the work you're doing.
Thanks very much. That's really kind. I appreciate you hosting these events. It's exciting for me. I'm thrilled that the book is available in Europe now. So thank you for that. And thanks for everyone for attending. Really excellent questions. And I wish that I had more time to keep talking shop, but I gotta go run a cupping at the moment. So
perfect. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. I hope everyone has a nice evening.
Thank you. You have a nice day, and all the rest have a nice evening. Thank you very much, Chris, and have a good cupping now.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you liked it, then also have a look at the interview I did with Chris a couple of weeks ago. And as I said, I really highly recommend this book that Chris has written about green coffee. And if you want to know more about coffee roasting machines, or green coffees, then have a look at our website, roastery.com. And if you have any further questions, then I always look forward to hearing from you.